Spotlighting Hawaii's leaders.
We want to bring in Governor David Ige.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Lieutenant Governor, good morning. Thanks so much for joining us. Mayor Derek Kawakami.
Thank you so much, Senator, for being here.
Spotlighting the issues.
Where is the virus right now in our community?
How much is this overall going to cost the state?
How are you responding to the community's concerns? Talk about the level of citations that you guys are writing.
Spotlight Hawaii with Yanji Denise and Ryan Kalei Suji on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Long's Drugs and Beachside Roofing.
Well, good Monday morning. Thanks so much for joining us here on Spotlight Hawaii. I'm Ryan Kalei Suji, joined by Yanji Denise, and we are so glad to see some of you already logging in this morning. We know also some of you are following the breaking news that is coming out of Washington, D.C. as the Pentagon holds that press conference on the permanent shutdown and closure and defueling of the Red Hill facility. It has been a topic that we have discussed at length on this show. We will continue to provide updates throughout the month with guests that will actually target and talk about that issue. But this morning, Yanji, we are focusing in on our hospitality industry and catching up with Peter Ingram at Hawaiian Airlines.
That's right. Peter Ingram has been a frequent guest on this program, and today he is joining us with some good news, we're told, some new routes to talk about. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning. Great to see you guys again. Yeah, we are announcing a couple of new seasonal flights for this summer for the peak travel period in the summer. We're going to be returning after a couple of years hiatus to have a direct flight between Kona and Oakland, and we're also adding our second Honolulu San Francisco flight, which we've had from time to time in the past. So adding a little bit more capacity into North America as we see really good demand coming in right now in the North America market as we've moved past the Omicron surge and are in a better place with the virus than we've been in a long time. So I'm feeling optimistic about what 2022 has to hold.
Yeah, of course, great news whenever you're adding routes. That's always a good sign of growth. If you can speak a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of volume with travelers coming to Hawaii now that we're seeing sort of the decline of Omicron, and as maybe travelers feel a little bit more comfortable, especially with the spring break season upon us. What have you been seeing numbers-wise that has caused Hawaiian Airlines to make this decision to add these routes, as well as just other expansion efforts overall?
Yeah, maybe I'll just go back a little bit to last year. Around this time last year, we're seeing bookings really start to recover in a meaningful way for the first time since the beginning of the pandemic. And by July last year, we were actually flying a bigger schedule to the U.S. mainland than we had before the pandemic. We had load factors had recovered as that booking curve had time to develop to historical levels in the high 80s and low 90s. And then we took a little bit of a bumpy road through the back half of last year, first with the Delta surge and then with the Omicron surge. And that tapped back demand for a period of time. But as Omicron cases have gone down, we've really seen a few very, very solid weeks of bookings. We never quite went as low in terms of demand as we did during the Delta surge. And now I see that recovery coming in full. So we're busy around the peak weekends. We're certainly busy around some of the spring break weeks now. And by summer, I expect our flights to be back to their normal level of fullness again, as we have that time for the bookings to develop and people to make their plans. And it looks really good on that front. We've also seen some strong recovery on Neighbor Island demand as people are getting more and more comfortable every day with traveling. We're not quite back to where we were before the pandemic in that part of our airline, because I think there are some permanent changes we'll have from things like we're doing right now, with where you can talk virtually, and it's not quite the in-person experience, but for some of the day trips that people might make to the Neighbor Islands, it will probably replace things. Some of the telehealth will probably take a little bit of demand away. But most of our business is coming back. The piece that's missing on Neighbor Island is those connections from our international flights. And that's the part of our network we really still need to see recover fully as the countries in the Asia Pacific area start to adjust their travel policies, hopefully in the weeks and months ahead.
And I know that is very difficult to predict. Of course, if there's another variant, it all goes, gets thrown out the window. But what are the indications you're getting from those international markets as to when countries like Japan and South Korea will allow for more robust travel?
Yeah, well, in December, we started Australia again on December 17th with 5 flights a week to Sydney, and we'll be flying 4 or 5 flights a week. And that was in response to Australia opening. And they actually faced some adversity right after opening up with Omicron cases rising throughout Australia. But they've made the decision, as we have in North America and what we're seeing in Europe, where people are saying, look, we're in a different place with the virus than we were. We've got vaccines, we've got therapeutics. We know how to manage it and how to treat it, and certainly it's still something we need to figure out how to live with. But we're going to figure out how to live with it. In Japan and South Korea, they still have some quarantine rules in effect. That always has an impact on demand. It just makes it very difficult for people to dedicate the time to quarantine on top of the time of their travels. But I'm hopeful that we're going to see some adjustment in those policies as we go forward. There already has been some positive moves, and what we're planning for is that we'll be ramping up our schedule throughout the second quarter and be to a more normal international schedule as we get into the summer and beyond. But that's always subject to change. We're going to have to adjust our schedule in response to demand, and that demand is going to follow what the policy environment is, not just what we're hoping for or what we're thinking it may be.
Recently, here on the island of Oahu, some of the restrictions have begun dropping, like the safe access Oahu, where those who live here or visit here no longer have to show a proof of verification of a negative COVID test or vaccine verification. We're going to also see some changes happening with the Safe Travels, a system that has been set up, that was stood up during the pandemic to really facilitate those that are entering the state. What are your thoughts about the state doing away with this Safe Travels program? And do you think that the timeline that has been laid for by the state is something that is welcome, a welcome exclusion, if you will, because it's not being added in, but a welcome exclusion of this program overall to the hospitality industry in Hawaii?
Yeah, I think it's helpful in that it reduces some of the friction of traveling, just like the safe access restrictions that you mentioned being loosened again, reduces some of the friction for people going out and getting into restaurants, having the tables closer together again. So we're looking forward to that. One of the things that we've tried to remain focused on throughout the pandemic is making sure that we were delivering the signature hospitality that Hawaiian Airlines is known for. And that's been more difficult when, you've got plexiglass up between people, when we were forced for a period of time to adjust some of our onboard services. And certainly there's a friction around the Safe Travels program, just making it more cumbersome for people to plan their trips and manage that day of travel experience. Most people who are flying with us are fairly infrequent travelers, and this was something that was unique to Hawaii, so people didn't quite know how to adjust to it or prepare for it. So we're happy that we've reached a point where we don't need to be gathering that information anymore. And I'm glad that the Governor Ige and the state have decided to continue moving forward into the new reality that we're going to have, as opposed to some of the things that we've had in place over the last 2 years.
I know this is probably hard to predict, but I'm interested to know if you can give us a sense of the profiles of the travelers who are coming. Are we seeing more families? Are we seeing more individuals? I think, we experienced last summer where we had this wave of tourists, and as you noted, many of whom had never been to Hawaii before and were relatively inexperienced visitors. I know that when someone buys a ticket, you don't necessarily ask them all those questions, but generally speaking, what are your expectations of who will be coming in the months ahead?
Yeah, we don't make them fill out a big questionnaire to understand everything about our guests, but we do have some demographic information, obviously. And if you think back to a year ago, as people were really starting to travel in numbers again, our demographics were a little bit different. We were skewing a little bit younger. Some of our, particularly before vaccinations became widespread, some of our more senior guests were choosing not to travel yet. That evolved as we moved through last year, and the demographics really started to mirror more what we had seen before the pandemic, where we have a spread of distribution, more families traveling, particularly around holiday times. So I think our mix of travelers as we get into this spring and into the summer is going to look a little bit more like pre-pandemic than what we saw in the early part of last year. Of course, the piece that's missing is the 1.5 million visitors that come to the islands every year from Japan. That's with international lagging. That is the most notable difference between today's demographics and what we had before the pandemic.
And so I'm wondering, when you are ready to welcome back, say, that Japanese visitors and those coming from Asia, and you resume those routes, what type of ramp up would that require for the company as a whole? Because I imagine that those, of course, will be routes that are going to be added once again. You're going to have an allocation of employees, flight attendants, crew members that will have to service those routes. Do you anticipate having to do more hirings? How do you accommodate all those visitors that may be expected to be coming as we see this reopening happening?
Yeah, it's one of our really important themes for 2022 is restoring our airline to operating at full scale. And from an aircraft perspective, we're ready. All of our airplanes have been flying, but the wide bodies that we use for our international service, our A330-200s, they've been flying lower utilization as we haven't had enough demand to fully utilize that fleet of 24 aircraft. Similarly, we had a number of employees who opted to retire over the course of the pandemic. And as we were flying a reduced schedule, we hadn't fully backfilled all those people. So from a hiring standpoint, we have a tremendous amount of activity going on right now. We're expecting to hire this year more than 100 pilots. We're going to hire upwards of 300 flight attendants. We have opportunities in our airport areas for customer service agents, for jobs on the ramp. We're looking for people in our maintenance organization as mechanics. We're hiring in our administrative staff. So one of our very, very high focuses right now is throughout the company is on recruiting and bringing people on, and training as we make sure we get people fully prepared to do these jobs. So this is a major focus for us, and it's a fantastic time to join our company as we're getting ready for another era of growth and opportunity. And we feel like we've weathered at this point the worst of the pandemic, and we're coming out the other side looking to be stronger and better than ever. And we're going to need some fantastic people to help us with that. And I'm looking forward to welcoming them into the company. We actually had a session earlier today called our Horizons class, which is how we welcome our new hires to our company. And I greeted, I think it was over 40 new hires to our company in various parts of the organization. And I expect to be having more of those Horizon sessions as we move through the year.
There are a number of employees who decided to retire also because of vaccination requirements. Are you going to be keeping those in place as well?
Right now, we're keeping that in place. Like everything else we've had to deal with during the pandemic, we have to manage circumstances as we get new information and as circumstances change, and this falls in that category. But for now, our vaccination requirement absolutely remains in place, and I think it's been very helpful for us as we move through the last Omicron surge. Even though we had more cases within our company than we had at any other point in the pandemic, we had nobody that I'm aware of that required hospitalization or had more adverse consequences than that. And I think the vaccination has been really helpful to allow us to manage through the last several months of challenges.
One of the restrictions that we've seen being changed throughout the country has been the mask mandate. Of course, Governor Ige has not yet allowed or called for a removal of the state mask mandate. He's saying that he will continue to wait and see what happens after the spring break vacation. He said this on our program last Friday, but wanted to get your thoughts on what you're hearing maybe from the federal level about the federal mask mandate that is required on airplanes. Your thoughts on where we're at with the mask mandate and anything that you can provide updates on and what you're hearing on a federal level, what may be changing there.
Yeah, I was in Washington, D.C. last week, meeting with our trade association that represents the airlines nationally and meeting with people in Washington. And this was one of the subjects that we discussed. It was noted that we're down to the point where the mask requirement is really only in place in a couple of places in the country. One is Hawaii, and the other is airplanes and airports. And as we've talked about before on these shows, one of the things that we learned over the course of the pandemic is that airplanes are actually incredibly safe places to be for in a period where we're worried about an airborne virus because of the fantastic circulation on the airplanes, the fact that fresh air is introduced all the time. Any air that does recirculate goes through HEPA filters as it would in a hospital. And so I feel very good about the safety of our airplanes. The federal mandate right now is set to sunset unless it's extended on March 18th. We haven't heard anything yet about an extension of that. And as we've seen requirements go away throughout most of the country, I think there's some prospect that will not be extended. But we're waiting to hear from the Department of Transportation and the TSA and the CDC about that. So right now it's business as usual with the mask requirement, but that could be changing in the weeks ahead.
We have COVID on the one hand, and also right now we are looking at Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That is a whole, that's many, many shows on its own. But one thing that is doing to the economy, of course, is raising the price of oil. And that, of course, impacts your industry. How does that affect your bottom line in the moment? And how are you planning for what could be, an enduring conflict, or at least, enduring sanctions on Russia and the rising price of oil? What could be months to come? We don't know.
The first comment I would make about that before we talk about the price of oil is the incredible human tragedy we're seeing on the news every night as people of a sovereign nation are being invaded for no good purpose. And obviously there are going to be impacts that we feel economically in the United States from that, but they all pale in comparison to what the people of the Ukraine are going through. As far as fuel prices are concerned, we had seen prices rise throughout the past year as demand globally for crude oil and for jet fuel and other petroleum products has recovered, and we're seeing levels now that frankly we haven't seen since the global financial crisis in 2008 when we spiked up to $140 a barrel. I'm not sure I ever thought we would see levels like that again, but we were close overnight to $130 a barrel. It is at various points in the 17 years now I've been at Hawaiian Airlines, our number one cost is either fuel or labor. And we're coming to a circumstance again with fuel prices rising that could move back where it hasn't been in the last several years, which is in our single largest cost item. We are in the fuel market all the time, so we're buying fuel right now at the current market prices. It is going to push our cost of operation up, and I think if it's sustained for a long period of time, all of our costs ultimately have to be recovered in the prices we charge. And generally, the way that adjustment happens is that capacity ends up being removed from the market if it doesn't have enough demand to support a higher price level. And it's too early to say exactly what's going to happen in this circumstance. We're less than 2 weeks since the beginning of the conflict. The pricing has been very erratic, but we've got to be mindful of needing to recover those costs over the longer term if they're sustained.
Of course, we know that you announced these new routes to the Bay Area, but we're getting some comments and some people who are asking of other new destinations that Hawaiian may be exploring. Now, I'm sure you're not ready to make any of those announcements publicly here on this show this morning, but what are the plans? I mean, when you're looking at the long term, as you sort of see the light at the end of this tunnel and you're looking for expansion efforts in other markets, is there any area, any country that you folks are potentially looking at to expand the service of Hawaiian Airlines and access to Hawaii?
Let me answer that maybe by explaining the context around the routes that we are adding this year. So you remember last year we added a couple of new destinations with our service to Orlando and to Austin, Texas, and to Ontario, California. And as we were thinking about ways to deploy our capacity for this summer, one of the things we were consciously not wanting to do was to add new routes that we might not be able to keep in the network as demand for our international network recovers, and we have plans to move capacity back into South Korea and back into various places in Japan. So we're keeping a little bit of dry powder right now in terms of capacity availability, so that when we do see the recovery in Japan, we can have the recovery there. And these routes, by being more connect the dots as opposed to a major investment to start a new city, means we can operate them seasonally and then adjust the schedule back as we need the aircraft and the crews for other markets. That being said, one of the things I've talked to our team about this year is the competitive environment that we operate in is disrupted, and we're not going to go back to what it was before the pandemic. We've seen extra competition from North America as business routes and some international destinations haven't seen demand recover fully, and we have to deal with that competition and make sure we give people a reason to choose Hawaiian Airlines when they fly. Similarly, as we do see the recovery internationally, I think there are going to be some new opportunities where some of our prior competitors are going to adjust their strategies and maybe decommit from some of the capacity that they had in the international routes to Hawaii, where it was less core to their strategies. And we all have to focus on the things that work best for our networks in an environment where we're still recovering from a disruption like none of us have ever seen. So I think that's going to lead to some opportunities and potentially some new flying internationally. But as you foreshadowed, Ryan, I'm not quite ready to announce any of those new ideas on the show today. So you're not getting that scoop.
There is an interesting question in our comments, and it's just, as businesses try to navigate what comes next with COVID, there is a question as to whether or not, an individual airline would keep a mask mandate, let's say, if the federal government decides to lift it. Some businesses, for instance, decide, yes, the mask mandate may be gone statewide if and when that happens, but in our store, you still have to wear a mask. Do you foresee airlines taking different approaches if and when the federal guidelines are lifted? And what is your take on that?
Yeah, time will tell on that. I think I don't have any insight into what other airlines are thinking about it. If you remember, long before the federal requirement made the mask requirement on board airplanes a reality, airlines had taken action ourselves, and we were one of the first at Hawaiian Airlines, but pretty quickly all of the airlines in the United States announced requirements. But as I think about it from our perspective, I won't try to speak for others, but from Hawaiian Airlines' perspective, I think with what we know now about the safety of the airplanes we operate and the circulation of air on the airplanes, I would feel comfortable not having a requirement. I do think that we'll have guests who choose to wear a mask, and of course that's perfectly fine. We'll have employees who probably choose to wear a mask, and I think that's probably perfectly fine. But if the federal requirement were lifted on the 18th, my expectation is that we'll no longer enforce a mask requirement on our flights, and until circumstances change to the point where we thought that might be necessary again, and hopefully we don't get to that point.
As we wind down here, wanted to get some final thoughts from you as we see again these routes being restored and we're seeing more people coming to our islands. There is always that question of how do you balance the visitor experience and bringing them to the islands, as well as the term of over tourism and just inundating some of the areas that have become favorites by locals, but now having to share it once again with tourists. We saw a large influx last year during that spring break time where there were many visitors to our islands. What are your thoughts overall on how you find this balance? And I know we had talked about some of the things of educating visitors before coming to the islands in the past on this show, but your thoughts as we move forward into what looks to be an optimistic time for the company as we see more visitors coming to our islands.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. We've heard a lot of concerns, obviously, throughout our communities and from some of our local leaders about the impact of tourism and the thousands of visitors that are in our islands every day. And obviously, there's a lot of benefit that comes from those visitors. There is the economic stimulus from the dollars they spend. There's the tax dollars that they put into our local coffers. But there's also some negative externalities that get created in terms of impact on our environment, our beaches, our hiking trails, traffic on our roads. And my approach to that, and what I would like to see more discussion of, is not curtailing the number of visitors we have artificially to avoid those negatives, but to use some of the dollars that come into our economy and come into our tax coffers to make sure we're directing those to support the infrastructure that we use locally and that our visitors use when they're here. And so if that means, building systems to to manage traffic at popular spots. Well, let's make those investments and let's direct some of those tax dollars in that way, as opposed to giving away all the benefits and the employment and the economic stimulus and the tax dollars that come from having visitors come to our islands.
Well, Yunji is muted. It happens once a show. She's still getting used to it. But we thank you, Peter, for being a part of our show here and for joining us and providing an update. It's, when we think back, we've had you on at the beginning of the pandemic, and those discussions, luckily and great to hear, are much different than the conversations that we're having now. So great to hear of all the things that are happening with Hawaiian Airlines and things returning, hopefully, back to normal. So thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with you, and thank you guys so much for making this platform available, not just for me, but for all of the other people who have appeared on it locally over the last couple of years. It really is a great format, and you guys do a great job with it.
Thank you so much.
Aloha.
Great to hear from Peter Ingram, and that announcement, if you missed it at the top, that he is announcing 2 new routes. They're seasonal routes, so they will last through the travel season. We're looking at Kona to Oakland, a direct flight there, and adding another Honolulu to San Francisco flight. That is a very popular destination for so many from Hawaii going to the Bay Area and vice versa as well. He talked about his optimism overall. They are doing hiring in a number of areas. What was striking to me, Ryan, 100 pilots, and of course, hiring at all levels. But when you hear that they have a need for that many pilots, obviously that means that they're flying a lot more planes, and that is good to hear. He talked about the international markets. They are hoping for a broader return from the East Asian market, hopefully in the summer. That's really contingent on what countries like Japan and South Korea decide when it comes to the quarantine rules. But overall, just hearing a lot of good news from Hawaiian Airlines this morning.
Yeah, and interesting to hear his thoughts about how you weigh that balance between restoring some of those routes that they do expect to bring back from Korea, from Japan, but also looking at other opportunities that may exist out there, knowing that Japan was such a major part of the hospitality industry and the amount of visitors that would come in to the islands. They are expecting those to be right on par with where they were when they left off. It maybe even more with the demand growing because of the Japanese have not had the opportunity to visit the islands for 2 years without some of those strict regulations. And so they are trying to find that balance of how they are able to restore those services that were once available, but also look at new opportunities that exist. We also heard his thoughts on the mask mandate. Of course, the federal mask mandate, that it will remain in place until March 18th. But saying that if the federal government allows that to expire, that Hawaiian Airlines would also allow that to sort of take effect with their flights, not making that a requirement, but of course, making available and optional for those who do feel safer traveling with a mask.
Yeah, and he also did emphasize that at Hawaiian Airlines, new employees will be required to be vaccinated. That follows the state. Governor Ige saying something very similar, that all new hires to the state, even though they're getting rid of the weekly testing or vaccination mandate on that level for current employees, that, those folks who perhaps have not been vaccinated but were testing weekly will be grandfathered in. At Hawaiian and at the state level, all new hires will have to be vaccinated. Peter Ingram saying that throughout Omicron, those vaccinations really did make a difference, that even though they did have a number of cases, to his knowledge, no one was severely sick, and he really credits the vaccine in large part for that.
But really, as I noted at the end, just to start contrast, we've been lucky enough to have Peter Ingram on really throughout the pandemic, and it's been interesting to hear the evolution of how this pandemic has impacted a company such as Hawaiian, a company that plays such a large part in our hospitality industry, but all the struggles that they were going through initially and the things that we were talking about then. A lot different conversation from what we had today, from what we were experiencing maybe say 2 years ago, and similar to what we were seeing in so many other industries and other individuals that we've spoken to over the past few years.
Yeah, we saw a lot of your comments and concerns about over tourism. One of the folks that has talked about that as well is the candidate for Lieutenant Governor, Ikaika Anderson. We're going to be talking with him on Wednesday. We've invited all the candidates for the governor's office and for Lieutenant Governor to join us in the weeks and months ahead. So we'll be spending full half hours with those folks. Ikaika Anderson is joining us on Wednesday. We'll be talking about tourism concerns and also just broader roles. What does he see that office to be? It is a very interesting office because it's a very public office, but it doesn't have any defined defined responsibilities other than stepping in for the governor when he or she is out of state. So what does he see for that office, and what are his concerns when it comes to tourism? We'll be talking about all of that Wednesday right here at 10:30.
We'll see you then. Aloha.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Longstrugs and Beachside Roofing.